Okay guys, so welcome back again. So in this video, let's learn about the context API and the use context hook. So firstly, we'll understand that what global state is and what context API is used for. And then we'll understand some fundamentals like lifting up the state and prop drilling. And then we'll move ahead and we'll create our context using the context API. And then we'll use the use context hook to consume that API. So in case if you already know that what global state is, what lifting up the state means, what prop drilling is, then you can directly skip to creating the context and using the use context hook. But for all those who doesn't know about the above three, should stay with me and let's go for a smooth ride. Okay, so here I've created a very basic React application and we only have this app.js file and this index.js file. So firstly, to understand that what global state means, we need to create a couple of components inside this components folder. So currently it is an empty folder. So let's create a couple of components. So let's create a new file and let's call it component a.js. And similarly, we'll create two more components, that is component B and component C. So now let's fill up these components. So I would be using RFCE to create a functional component here. And let me provide in a heading here that says component A, like this, and the similar thing we would be doing inside other components also, that is creating the basic components. So now our components are ready. So now what I want to do, I want to go to my app.js file, and what I want is that I want to import these two components, that is A and B, inside this file. So let me import those components, or if I start typing here, that is after the H1 here, they would be automatically imported because of VS Code. So component A like this, and then we would be importing the component B here like this. And if we save our application, we see that we get component A and component B, and these files have been automatically imported. And now what I want is that component C should be the child of component B. So let's go to component B here, and here I would provide in the component C here, that is component C like this, and this component C has been automatically imported here. So now let me save this. So now what we have here is this, that inside the parent app.js file, we have two child components. That is, we have component A and component B. And inside the component B, we have this component, that is component C, as a child of component B. So now suppose we have something here, that is we have some state here. So let's create a fake state here. So let's say that we are using a state variable here, that is use state name, set name, and the initial state is truly Mithal, like this. And of course we need to import use state here from React. So we can simply say use state like this. And now we want to display this name inside component B. So what we can do, we can simply type here, or let me put a paragraph here. We can say name is something, and that's something we can write a JSX expression and we can say name. So if we save this, we see that we are getting name here inside component B. And now what if we want the same state variable to be available to component C? So what we can do, we can go to component C here, and here we can accept that name state as a prop inside this C component. So what we can do, we can simply do it like this, that is name equal to this name like this. And now we can go inside component C, and here we can simply display the name, that is name, like this. But firstly we need to extract it from the props, because props contain the name variable. So if we save here, we see that component C, we have the name here. Now what if inside component A, we want to have the same state variable, that is this name. But as we see that inside app.js, component A and component B are siblings. So what we can do, we can simply cut this state out from here and we can directly paste it inside our app.js file. So if we are able to paste that state inside this app.js file, then we can easily pass that name as a prop to this component A and component B, and then we would be getting name inside each of the components. So this thing is called lifting up the state. So if we cut this state out from here, so let me cut this state out from here, that is from component B. And now let's go to app.js, because we want the name inside component A. So therefore we need to provide in a state here. And thus we have a global state here. But what we need to do, we need to pass this name as a prop to component A and component B. So we can say in component B that name should be equal to name like this. And now we need to go to component B to extract it out of the props. So we can simply say name here, and now everything looks fine, but we need to import useState here inside app.js file. So we can simply say import useState from React like this. So if we save this, everything works the same way. And now if we want this name variable inside component A, and that was the only reason, because we lifted up the state from component B inside app.js file, so that we can provide the same state variable inside component A. So here we can also do the same thing, that is name should be equal to name by passing name as a prop here. And now if we go to component A, and here we can extract that name as a prop here, that is by using restructuring here. And here we can simply type out the name here, that is name should be name like this. And if we save this, then we see that our component A also receives truly method. So now what are we doing here? So basically we see that is from component A, first we lifted up the state. Since we want the state variable to be present inside the sibling components, that is component A is a sibling of B, therefore we lifted up the state. And now what we started doing, we started passing this name property or this name value or this name state variable as a prop to component A and component B. So that's what we are doing here. And now if we look inside this component B, we see that we are passing this name property of component B to the name property of component C, and then we are utilizing that name property in component C as the name here. But what if the name is not even required inside this component B? So now let me simply comment this thing out from here, that is we do not want to display this name inside component B. So here what we are doing, though component B doesn't even require the name property, but still we need it from the app.js file as a prop here, because we needed to pass it to component C, because component C is a child of component B. So therefore what we are doing, we are simply drilling the prop from one component to another in the tree of components. So this is what is called as prop drilling. This is what is called as a global state, because now each of the components inside this app component can have this state variable, that is name, and we already saw that what lifting up the state means. So now comes to the point that what is a context API? So basically context API is an easy way to create global variables that can be passed around in the React app, and this is an alternative to prop drilling. So now let's see that how do we use the context API and how do we use the useContext hook to consume the context. So for that, what I am going to do, I am going to create a very simple component, that is a counter component with two buttons that would increase the count and that would decrease the count. So firstly, what I am going to do, I am going to remove all these components here from here, and then let me remove all these files from here. That is, we do not require these components anymore here. They were only for explanation. So let me remove this thing from here. So now let's go to inside our components and let's create a new file and let's call it mycounter.js like this. And here let me quickly scaffold it by creating a functional component here that is called myCounter. And inside here, what we want to do, let me firstly display an h3 here, that is counter component like this. And now let me describe our count variable here, that is useState, and the count would be count, set count would be set count, and the initial state would be 0. For now we need to import useState here because we are using useState here like this. And now we can simply display the count here. So in the paragraph tag, so we can simply say count is this count like this. And now if we save this, nothing would happen. And let's go to our app.js file. And now let me import that component, that is myCounter like this, and it automatically imported from the components folder. So if we save this, we are getting an error because of something. So let me refresh this page here. So we see that we are getting this counter component, that is myCounter here, and the count is 0. So now let me quickly create two buttons here that would increase the count and that would decrease the count. So here let me create a button. So button would be increase count, and the second button should simply say decrease count like this. And then we have an onClick method on each of them, and here we would have a function that would be called increase count, and this function we would be creating in a moment. And for the second button we would be having another onClick event, and that would simply call this function, that is decrease count. And now let me create these two functions here at the top of this component. So here we should say, or let me simply call it a function here, that is function increase count, or let me copy it from here like this, and this would do something. And then we have another function here, and that function should be called decrease count. So let me paste in the function name here like this. And now what this function should be doing, it should simply set the count to something, that is to count plus 1, simply like this. And here we would be having another function that would be setting the count to count minus 1. So now if we save this, we see that we have these two buttons here. So if we click this button, we are increasing the count. If we decrease the count, we are decreasing the counter. So now what if we want this count, that is this count variable, to be available inside this app.js file? That is, somehow we want this count variable to be present inside this app.js file. That is, we want to use this state variable, that is this count variable, to be present inside our app.js file. We already saw that we can lift up the state, we can lift up all the functions, and then we can pass this count variable as a prop and these functions as a prop to this my counter thing, and then we are good to go. But this is not good if you are having a real world application, because you might be say 10 to 5 components down inside your component tree, and then you want to lift up something. So it would be very tedious for you to lift up the state and then pass each and every function and each and every variable as a prop using PropDrilling. So what we can do, we can use the context API to create a context for this count variable, and then we can use that context to get the value of this variable and then these functions by using the useContext hook. So for that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go inside my source folder, and here I'm simply going to create a new folder, and that would be called contexts. Though it is not required, but I prefer doing it this way, that is to keep each and every context inside this context folder. So, and here now I'm going to define my context file here, that would be called counter context.js like this. And here firstly we need to import something from React, so we can simply say import from React like this. And what we want to import, we want to import useState, we want to use create context. And now what we can do, we can simply create a context using this create context. So let me minimize this thing here. So firstly we should say const counter context equal to create context like this. It is as simple as this to create a context. And now we need to do something more inside this file. That is, we want to build a function that is a provider for this counter context. So we can call that function anything, but here I am simply going to call that function that is counter context provider. So we can say counter context provider. And basically, as the name suggests, it simply provides a context that is the current context inside this file. So we can have it like this. And now we need to return something from this counter context provider function. So we need to return something. So let it be this way for now. And then what we can do, we can simply export this counter context provider as the default value. So we can simply say export default counter context provider like this. And then we also need to export this counter context to be used by the useContext hook. So either we can do it right now or we can leave it for later, but it is better to do it right now so that we should not forget it, that we need to export this counter context from this file. And now we need to return something from this function. And what do we want to return? We simply want to return the provider of this counter context. This is only a name of the function. This is not an actual provider, but inside this return statement, we would be returning an actual provider of this counter context that we have just created here. So what we can say counter context dot provider like this. And then we have this thing here. And now what should be between this thing here? Here we can simply say props dot children, and stay with me and it will all make sense. And now from where props will come? Props will come from here, because we can simply take props as a value in this counter context provider. And here inside this counter context provider, we can pass in a value here, and that value would be something that would be of use for us. So value would be equal to something. And now since we are interested in extracting the state and this function out of this my counter file so that they can be used anywhere inside our application, so what we can do, we can simply cut this state and these functions from here. And now we can go to our counter context.js, and here we can simply paste in those functions and that state variable, that is the count and the set count. So what do you want to pass in this value thing here? You can pass in each and every value that you want to be accessible by any of the other components that use this counter context provider or that are a child of this counter context provider. So here what we can pass, we can simply say count, because we want this count to be accessible by any component in our component tree. We also want the increase count method to be available to any component. We also want to make this decrease count method to be available to all our components. So now let's save this. Or instead of passing in value and an object here, what you can do, you can simply create your own values object here or value object here, and you can simply paste these things from here. That is, let me cut it out from here and let me paste it here like this. It remains the same thing, and you can simply pass in the value here because it is much more easier to read. So now everything that needs to be done in this counter context.js file has been completed. So now let me save this file from here, and now let's go to our app.js file, and here we need to import that counter context provider. So we can say import counter context provider from, we need to go inside the context folder, and then we need to use this file, that is counter context, like this. And now you need to wrap each and every component inside your application in which you want to use these things here. That is, you want to use this state variable here, you want to use this increase count function, you want to use this decrease count functions. So let's go to our app.js, and here we can wrap each and every component inside this counter context provider. So we can say counter context provider like this, and then we can wrap this thing inside this counter context provider. And now how to consume the values that are provided by this counter context provider? We can go to our mycounter.js file. Firstly, we need to import the useContext hook because we are using the context here. And then we also need to import the counter context. So we can say import, we need to go inside OneUp folder and then into the context folder, and then we need to import the counter context, and from this counter context we simply want to import this counter context. And now here we can say const something equal to useContext, and here we need to provide in the counter context like this. And what do we have here? We have each and every value that is being provided by this counter context provider. That are these values, that is the count, increase count and decrease count. So even if we copy this thing from here, that are these things, and if we go to mycounter.js, so if we paste them here and if we save our application would be working as it was working before when we had the state variable and these functions inside this file. So if we click on increase count, we are able to increase the count. If we want to decrease the count, we are able to decrease the count. But now let's see the beauty of this context API. So now let me create some more components here. That is, let me create a component here. That is component a.js, and let me create another file that is component b.js like this. And now inside this component a, let me create a functional component, and this component a should only display the value of the count. So let me give it a style also so that it should be visible to us. That is background color to be something, and that should be wheat. And here we can simply display in the paragraph, that is count is something, and here we can here we want the count. So what we do here, we can simply say import something from we need to go inside the context thing here, that is the context, the counter context, and we need to import this counter context here like this. And we also need the useContext hook, so we can say useContext like this, and here we can use that useContext hook. So we can say const something equal to useContext, and here we want to provide in the counter context like this. And since in this component we only want the count thing here, so we can simply extract the count here like this. So now if we save this file and if we include this component a inside our app.js, so let's include that thing here, that is component a like this. So if we save this file, we see that cannot resolve this thing here. So what is the problem? So let's go to this file here. So it's because of the space here. So if we save this, we see that we are getting count as -6. So if we increase the count, we are able to see that the changes are available in myCounter.js file as well as in this component A, because this count 3 is coming from component A. So now let's use this component B as a child of component A. So let's create this, or let me simply copy this component A from here. Let me copy it from here and let me paste it here inside component B, and the name should be component B, and here we need to export component B. And here, instead of this p tag here, what we want to have a button here. So, and let me also change the background color to something that is red. And here we want to have a button, and here we want to simply say increase count. So increase count like this, and then we have something on click, that is on click equal to something. And here inside this component B, we do not want the count variable here, but instead what we want this thing here, that is to increase the count. So let's copy this thing from here. Let's go to this thing here, and instead of extracting count, we can extract this thing here, that is increase count. And here inside the on click event, we can pass an increase count. So now let's save this and let's go to app.js file. And here inside this component A, let me paste this component B as a child of component A like this. And now if we save this, we have this component B here, which is a child of component A. And if we increase the count is increasing. We are able to decrease the count. And if we try to increase the count from this component B, we are also able to increase the count. So we see that we haven't passed any prop here from component A to component B. As we can see here, that no props have been passed, and neither from myCounter.js file, no state has been uplifted to this app.js file, but instead we are using the context API to provide in a global state for our application. And now the last thing of this video, and this is a bonus of this video, that is if we go to this myCounter.js file, we see that we are importing useContext from React and counterContext from this counterContext.js file. If we go to component A, we are importing useContext here, and then we are importing counterContext. And if we go to component B, we are again importing those two things here, that is useContext and counterContext. So what if we can make our lives easier, and instead of using the context here, what we can do, we could create a custom hook inside the counterContext.js file. So now inside this file, that is counterContext.js, we are going to make our custom hook. So instead of exporting this counterContext, we want to export our own hook, that is useCounter, and that is the name of our hook. And you all know that all hooks start with use. So instead of exporting this as a constant here, what we could do, we could export our constant hook here, that is const useCounter equal to a function here like this, which returns something. And since we only have a single line in this function, so we can simply write useContext like this, and here we can pass in the counterContext, that is this counterContext, and this useContext has been automatically imported here from React. And now we need to export this, so we can say export const useCounter, and now wherever we are using this counterContext, we need to use this hook, that is useCounter. So we can copy it from here. Let me save this file from here. Let's go to component B, and here instead of importing counterContext, let me import this useCounter. And now let me also remove this thing from here. And here instead of using the useContext, what we can say, we can simply say useCounter like this. So that's all what we need to do. And now let's do the same thing in other files also. So let's go to component A. So instead of importing useContext, let's import useCounter like this. And now instead of using useContext, let's simply use this useCounter like this. And now let's go to myCounter.js file. And again, let's remove this thing here and let's use the useCounter hook. And now instead of using the context here like this, what we could do, we could simply say useCounter like this, and everything should work the same way as it was before. So if we save this, and now if we increase the count is increasing. We can decrease the count, and we can also increase the count from here. But I hope that this is a much easier way That is by creating your own hook inside the counter context, and then you can use that hook inside any of your files. And this looks much more cleaner to me than using useContext here and then providing in the counter context here. So guys, that's all about this video. So if you have liked the video, do hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, do subscribe to our channel. So thank you, bye bye, tata, take care and have a good day and have a great day.